This is CCS America's video series on machine vision lighting, where we get technical about machine vision lighting techniques and technology so you can solve lighting applications more efficiently in-house. I'm Emily Ting, marketing specialist at CCS America and co-host of this series, together with Lindsey Sullivan, our technical marketing manager, who is here to share all her knowledge and expertise from her time as our engineering manager. Lindsey, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Getting ready for SemiCon West next week, which is just like at this point, it's a mental preparation. All the hard work is done.
It's funny you say that 'cause I'm just like at the point where it's like, oh, this is what I feel something to not have to worry about going to a trade show next week. And it just feels so good, like stress free. My outlook is brighter. The world is a more pleasant place.
You can have another baby again, just so I don't have to go to the next one.
They'll have to negotiate with Mark about
Yeah.
that.
Mark, remember that time I ate for 5 days? I won't have to do that again if we have another. I could probably get him
You
with
won't
that
have to leave
argument.
once a month. Yeah. I wish you guys all the best. I'm actually kind of bummed because Arizona sounds like an interesting place. And aside from the Grand Canyon, I've never been. So I wouldn't have hated being able to explore and visit Arizona. But I am so, so happy that I don't have to go to a trade show for it. It's like arguably like my marketing highlight of this year. So I get to go to a trade show.
Oh, yeah. That, if it is fair, I would also agree that my marketing lowlight is having to go.
Which is ironic because that's like probably the biggest thing we're responsible for is doing trade shows as the marketing team.
It's funny because it's
Here
not
we
so
are.
bad like when you're there, but it's like the stress of like what's gonna go wrong that I have to fix and like the unknown of like because nothing's gonna be perfect. There's gonna be something that happens. How big of a deal is it gonna be? So it's just like the unknown of like what that's gonna be, if we can fix it. Did I plan everything properly? Once it's like there and established, I actually like don't mind trade shows as much. Just the setup and the getting there and that's my hardest part. If I could
Yeah.
just be a salesperson and show up to a trade show, I think I'd actually enjoy them.
Don't say that out loud because you know we're looking for a salesperson right now.
Just go through all
And
the.
somebody might take that as nope, we found our candidate.
You
I'm
don't want me
about
to
to
be a
lose my
salesperson.
my marketing partner in crime.
I
You
did
don't
sales
want
once. I
that.
don't think I'll do it again. It was fun until it wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. All right. With that, let's talk lighting. And today we're going to go into visible wavelengths and how we use those in machine vision. But before we jump into the lighting side, we have to get into the camera side because that's probably the biggest determiner of what visible wavelength you end up using aside from what your inspection task is. So we're not camera experts, but we do know there are monochrome cameras and there's color cameras. So we have that going for us, which is, a step higher than some people who have to work with machine vision, but, don't know a lot of it about it because they're just like, yes, use color camera. What else would you possibly use? Monochrome cameras, even though they're black and white images, higher resolution and sensitivity, lower cost. There's plenty of benefits that a camera manufacturer is probably more well equipped to describe. But yeah, there's, getting contrast with a camera that sees color in a similar way to the human eye. And there's contrast that you get with camera that only sees black and white. So first question for you, Lindsey, is how do you approach creating contrast differently with those two types of cameras?
Yeah, that's always a good one because, when do you pick color? When do you pick monochrome? It's the time-old question. So when you have a monochrome camera and you want to create contrast with it, if everything that you're doing is kind of all the same color, like it's just gray on gray or something like that, then you create the contrast with looking at the form factor of the light that you're using. But if there's color on your sample, then we can use that to create the contrast. And it's one of those things where when your light is shining on your sample, the color that it is what light it's reflecting. So like a red, you know, pen is going to absorb all the blue and green and reflect the red. So to a camera, it's essentially saying the presence or absence of light. So if you shine the white light down and you have like red, green, and blue, it's going to reflect red, it's going to reflect blue, and it's going to reflect green. So it'll just see gray. But if you shine only red light down, it will reflect red, but it will absorb the blue and the green. So then we can see the presence of light with the red and then the absence of light with the blue and green. So the monochrome camera can have higher contrast, highlighting just one color by using the red light to lighten up the red on the sample, and then everything else darkens, and you get this really nice black and white contrast. If, though, you need to see the red and the blue and the green maybe at different times, then if you only have red light, you're kind of hiding the blue and the green. And so if you're only trying to see the difference between like one color, for example, then monochrome and a colored light is great. But if all of the colors kind of come into play, then you either have to do a color camera or you do monochrome with a white light, but then everything is gray. So depending on how you need to see the colors would be how you would determine those. So color camera can be really beneficial in a lot of ways of giving you the ability to distinguish between all the colors without having to pick one in a way.
Yeah, you mentioned like using white light with a monochrome camera versus a color camera. And I guess depending on what you're inspecting, either can work potentially, but it kind of reminds me of how, there's accessibility rules of color contrast where it has to be either dark on white or white on dark. And if the colors are too close together in lightness, then it's too hard to read. And that's when, like on web page design or whatever, it's not good to use that because then, people can't read. It kind of reminds me of that in a way. And I don't know if you would say because it's a machine, it can do it better than a human per se, or if there's a kind of hard rule for even cameras, like it has to have at least this amount of contrast to be able to see what you need to see.
Yeah, there is that rule of because you can pick like the grayscale value, 0 from 255. So when you put it over white, it's 255. If you put it over something black, it's 0. So the best contrast is, 0 and 255. And as you get closer to like 150, they're all going to be the same. So you can definitely see the difference between those values of my whites are this, my darks are that. Get the histogram, make sure it's enough to do that. So there definitely is that component to it. And the kind of nice thing of a camera is you can quantify that instead of the subjectiveness of, does it look good? The interesting thing about cameras, though, is a lot of times you can use filters to increase that contrast for the tool. So as much as lighting experts, we always say get the image perfect as best you can, but even sometimes adding a filter to it, like a binary filter, that will just enhance the tool's ability to function works as well. So there's two components to it, the vision and lighting side, getting the right numbers of differences. I think, the rule of thumb, I want to say like at least a difference of 50, but it's been so long since I've even had to think of that number that easily could be incorrect. Is like, like what it does.
There's a camera manufacturer who listens to this, like fact check us in the comments or something. We'll pin it.
Yeah, or I'll ask Ray. I'll be like, what's the grayscale number? But yeah, so, you can kind of improve it a little bit if you need to by using a filter. But like with color cameras, kind of like you were saying, you can, blue is very different from yellow. So a color camera doesn't necessarily have those same values. I love the tool that you can like look at everything blue in the picture. So you can like point out everything that's blue and then like that's, a big blob and stuff like that. And it ignores everything that's yellow. So you have that ability as well to choose colors that you want each tool to focus on, which is always really convenient and nice.
Yeah. You bring that up and it's maybe nice that cameras don't have color blindness per se. Like we humans do, I think. Speaking of my good old friend, the Theory of Light and Color series, this came up at some point where, humans have color blindness, but machines don't, which is, a great thing about it. But at the same time, each camera has its own sensitivity. There was a point where they talked about ways to measure brightness, and there's the objective measure of brightness, radiant quantities, and then luminous quantities is how we perceive it. But then I think CCS had like sensor metric quantities. And I don't know if other companies use it, but for them, that was just like being able to measure the camera sensitivity to the spectrum because it's not the same camera to camera. I would assume it's not vastly different, but it's something to be careful of if you need like sensitivity to certain wavelengths over others.
They actually can be vastly different. That is another thing to consider too, is, when you have the sensor of the color camera versus the sensor of the monochrome. The color camera is going to have, how sensitive is it to red, how sensitive is it to green and blue, versus the monochrome is going to have more of a peak wavelength. And sometimes that's more red, sometimes it's more green. It kind of depends on the sensor that they're using. And so if you're using a camera that's got more of peak sensitivity at green, but you're using a red light, you're not actually able to capture and like utilize all of the light that we're shining down, because it's only going to take in about 80% of what it could be capturing if you were to use like a green light. So sometimes if you do plan on using one color in the monochrome camera, it's better to pick a camera that has a sensitivity near the wavelength that you're doing. And the same thing actually does work for red, green, and blue. They'll have different peaks at different wavelengths, and our red light's 525 nanometer, but sometimes the peak wavelength is like 550. So you're not necessarily optimizing it. It's still gonna, see the red light. It's still gonna do everything, but that's just a little bit different of how much it will actually be using the light most efficiently or not. So yeah, those do come into play, and they can have an impact, mostly in the IR, honestly, because like that tail can drastically drop off or not. So if you're using an IR light with the monochrome camera, which you have to do with monochrome camera, you're only getting like 20% of the response to the sensor. So it's hard to get enough light in those scenarios sometimes.
Once again, learn something new that again, it's about cameras, not lighting. So I'll give myself a pass.
I think you should.
But yeah, so let's now get into the actual lighting side. Again, going back to when people don't know as much about machine vision lighting, I think their default is white light. What else is there? We have white light from the sun, white light in our daily life. What would be the point of using a blue light and all that stuff? But let's talk about why white light has limitations and in what cases it's maybe not the right solution.
White light is interesting because it was invented because the blue LED was invented. So the spectrum of a white LED has a big peak at blue, and then it dips down, and then it kind of rises back up and trails off again. It's not like the flat sunlight spectrum where it's got a high response at every wavelength. So when we use it with a monochrome camera or a color camera, a lot of times because there's that bluish tint to the white LED, it can skew the colors. They can kind of have a bluish tint as well. So it's actually pretty, I wouldn't say important in every application, but some applications it's very important to white balance the camera. And essentially what's that saying is it's a algorithm that the camera has where you say, okay, this little pixel here is like the perfect white. So calibrate everything. We'll bump up the gain of the red, bump down the gain of the blue, and make it so everything is the perfect color. So you get more of a high color rendering index. And it's not doing it with the light, but the camera is compensating for the lack of the light. But if you use something like a hyperspectral white LED, which is more of a flat spectrum, you don't have that problem as much because you don't have that big peak of blue. It's really going to give you more of the actual accurate color that you see, and the camera will see more what we see type of thing from the sunlight. And this mostly comes up in, color cameras where you're doing that because you're trying to see the difference between like a light blue and a dark blue. And if you have a blue tinted LED, it's going to make it all kind of look the same. And then you white balance it, you can make that difference more apparent. But like you wouldn't be able to do that really with a monochrome camera and a white light because it would just kind of still be gray. And then using white light with a monochrome camera, everything has the presence of light, so there's not necessarily contrast. And so everything just looks gray, which sometimes that's what you want, right? Like sometimes you want the consistency between all the objects, and sometimes you're trying to create the contrast by highlighting different colors. So in some situations, it's great, and in others, it is the opposite of what you want. You need something else.
Yeah, from your experience, were there application requirements where if like you saw them come up or if you saw like 3 of them come up, you're just like, all right, white light is probably going to be the right solution versus, okay, we need to go monochromatic light.
Yeah, if this samples that we're testing have a lot of color variation, like lids of peanut butter, bake coat on them. You know, they're going to be red, they could be blue, they could be yellow, they could be green. Like they can vary so much that if we just had a red light, it would work for all the red samples, but all of the blue ones, you wouldn't be able to read. So if there's a lot of color differences or like pill packs, blister packs, where some pills are blue, some pills are red and blue, some pills are green, the more they vary, the less one color will solve everything. And then at that point, you kind of have to just do white and hope for the best that it gives everything and, you know, enough contrast that you can still solve the application.
Yeah. Speaking of high color accuracy, you mentioned balancing, but on the lighting side of it, there's our high color rendering LEDs that CCS likes to tune about a lot. And in your mind, is it good to use both of them together in tandem to like get the highest color accuracy, or is there a case for going, you know, the lighting over the camera or vice versa to get the right color accuracy measurement?
Yeah, so it's funny. There's kind of the CCS and Effilux both have their own product. The HSI that I mentioned is Effilux's version of the natural white LED that CCS has. So they both have the flat spectrum of providing the high color rendering index. And you would do both. Like you would use the natural white CCS LED or the Effilux HSI, and then you would white balance the camera. So then you're getting the most accurate representation of the true color of the object that you could get. Because it's, you know, perfect. It's good. The natural white LED and the HSI LEDs are much better than, you know, we could have gotten 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but it's not sunlight. We'll never be able to like fully recreate sunlight. So there's always going to have to be some compensation on the camera side to make it better.
Yeah, but I guess better that than, I don't know, other types of white light sources that go too warm or, you know, yeah, too
And
warm, too orange.
I will say for most applications, like a white LED, even with that blue bump, is sufficient. It's really the ones where like we're trying to see very subtle differences in green. Like, you know, they're painting green. We need to make sure this green is being, you know, the paint was mixed and it's the perfect like John Deere green, right? And then there's a very slight difference that it can be because the color is so much part of their brand. And so for that one, if we're going to do something like that, we have to make sure the like color index, high color rendering index is perfect. But like if you're just looking at the lid of a peanut butter jar, like as long as the ink is dark enough and everything else is light
There's a
enough,
red
it's
lid,
fine.
there's
Yeah.
a blue lid, there's a green.
Yeah, it's not going to be so detrimental that like, you know, you can't read the blue lid because of the blue LED. That's not going to be a thing. It's just for the really high coloring rendering applications where you need to like use those. Or a hyperspectral. The HSI is a hyperspectral light. So if you're using a hyperspectral camera, you need a full spectrum as well.
We'll save all that, the advanced wavelengths for a future podcast episode. I said it. I was trying hard to keep it to video because saying podcast makes me really uncomfortable. But here we are. Anyways, we'll move into monochromatic visible wavelengths and the standard, you know, red, green, and blue are the most common ones. And, you know, like I said earlier, I think it doesn't, you know, come to mind like immediately why we should use this. And I think that's something that when you guys are doing training, you have to teach people about a lot, like how the different colors of light can actually, you know, change the image completely. Are there, you know, certain common misunderstandings that you've seen that you want to, you know, myth bust here right now?
Yeah. There's the old myth that like red is the go-to default wavelength. And I think it was a cost at the time. It was easiest to manufacture kind of thing. That's not really the case anymore. If red works for your application and you want to do it, sure. But red and white and blue, they're all going to be the same price for the most part for your lights. So you're not really saving any money by picking a red light anymore. And sometimes like a, you know, white light would be better for your application. So you're making it harder on yourself if you try and do that. But that's kind of the biggest one that I come across the most. But the general little tidbit that we say is like colors lighten and opposite colors darken. So if you look on the color wheel, you have a red light, anything on your sample that's like red, yellow, orange, it's going to appear brighter, and everything that's like blue or green is going to appear darker. And so it's just a nice way when you see your color sample to be like, ah, this is blue and I want this part to be bright, so I'll grab a blue light. Like you can kind of already know. So it's not necessarily a misconception by any means, but it is just like a something to put in your mind to expedite the process of picking the color of your light, of just understanding the color wheel and how everything goes. But that's kind of the biggest misconception, though, is that red is the default. It's really not anymore.
We talk about how wavelength can be like the difference maker in getting the contrast you need. In your experience, how big could that difference be? Was it, like 20% difference or whatever? 50% difference? Probably not. But I guess how drastic can the difference be?
Yeah, and it all depends on the sample, like if your sample is red and blue only, that's going to be like night and day. But if your sample is like purple and blue, like purple has red and blue in it. So if you use a, blue light, you'll have some blue and then you also have a little bit of blue. Like if you're trying to lighten the blue and you use blue light, you'll lighten the purple as well. And so it depends on how similar your colors are on your sample to how much contrast you can get because of how much of that, specific wavelength the sample will reflect at any point. So you can't say like you'll always get a 30% bump with a red light. Like that won't tell you anything. That would be a lie if someone ever tells that to you. So
Japan would get really mad at us if we like put that in marketing. It was just like you're leaving us open to getting sued. That's a big no, slap on the wrist.
yeah, take it down now.
Take it down immediately and put out a formal.
Exactly.
What was I going to ask? Because it brought up an interesting question. Oh, we've been talking about like using a monochrome light because of the color of the material, but are things like, I don't know, the material itself, like if it's, metal versus plastic, or depending on the texture of the surface of the sample, if it's like, glossy, smooth, or, rough, does that have any, or does color wavelengths interact differently with those?
Yeah, like technically yes, but actually I want to say no, because different wavelengths have different scattering properties. So the shorter wavelengths, UV blue, they scatter quite a bit versus the longer ones tend to penetrate through. So if you're doing something, like metal and stuff like that, you'll get more scattering with the blue light than you will with the red. But that isn't going to make or break the application. You could still solve it with the red light. It would be probably like 10% better with the blue, maybe. So yeah, but most of the time when you get into the texture of your sample, the form factor is going to be more impactful than the wavelength. So sort out your form factor first. Make sure that is, hiding the texture if you want with the dome light or enhancing it with, the low angle light. And then after that, pick the color that changes it and optimizes it the best. So like kind of, but no.
Thought I'd ask just in case.
I think, sorry, go for it.
Or the thing that I like remembered was on our, beautiful, wonderful lighting poster. I think it was, we did have that example of like, what was it? Some kind of chip or
soldering
something.
ball.
There was like gold and the soldering, and, red and blue did make a difference. I don't know if it was because it was like gold or if because gold is yellow.
That was it. It was just the wavelength. The gold had a yellow tint, so the red light lightened it, and then the blue light darkened it. So that's why I'm actually not a huge fan of that one, because I think it does kind of confuse people that like red will work better on soldering, but like no, it's just the wavelength. Gold is more yellow than not. And kind of a little bit related, but not really. I feel like this is a part where HQ and I differ in terms of how we train. Because I've heard HQ do trainings and they're like, yes, there's a big difference. Like, you want to do this. And I'm like, but is there? And so I feel like they're much more like official, like, these are the rules. This is the property. And I'm like, yeah, technically it's the property, but like, it really doesn't matter that much. So
Just
it's
test
kind of funny.
test all the wavelengths either way, and that will be the best, I guess, vote of confidence,
Yeah.
whether you follow the rule.
Yeah, actually, tangent with that, testing the wavelengths is much easier to do if you have a full color light or if you have a white light and a really good filter kit. We've definitely talked about this principle in a lot of the content we create, but having a white light and then you can just hold a filter up and see how the red light will look, the blue, the green, is a great way just to compare all of the differences that the light will do. But when you do that, whether you're using a full color light or the filters, make sure that you adjust the intensity of the image to match for every single one. So pick like the brightest spot on your image and hover over that and make sure that the grayscale is about 200. And then when you change the color, adjust the intensity so that same spot is 200 again. Because then you're not going to pick, because sometimes it looks like there's more contrast just because the image is brighter. But really, there would be more contrast with a different wavelength if the intensity of the image was the same. So make sure that your images are the same intensity, consistently so you can do a fair comparison, and the focus. When you get to like lensing and stuff like that, there's this thing called axial. Oh, oh God. Axial's the word. Anyway, different wavelengths have different focus heights. And so sometimes if you have a blue light and then you switch to red, your image looks just like slightly blurry. And that's because it is. So you adjust your focus level, adjust your intensity so you can compare the apples to apples, and then order whatever like specific wavelength that is. Like don't order a white light and put a blue filter on it because you're only going to use like 30% of the intensity of the light, but just order a blue light. You can still put the blue filter on. That'll have its benefits as well, but make sure the light you get is just the color that worked best. That was a super
Yeah,
tangent that like
no,
wasn't even a question
I'm
that you
glad
asked.
no, but I'm glad you brought it up. What was it? I think I first heard you bring it up in common pitfalls, maybe, and I was like, oh, I didn't know about changing the grayscale before, so I thought that's good tip, which made it feel like doing that presentation was worthwhile, aside from the many other reasons it was worth doing. But yeah, that one stood out to me as a new learning for me. So the tangent was worthwhile, and it also, I think, brought up something important about full color, in that there's the full color where, a single LED chip has red, green, and blue all in the same chip. And then there's what we call RGB lighting, where it's, a red LED, green LED, and blue LED, and then it repeats. So full color is what CCS tends to do, and RGB is what FLX tends to do. I'm not sure if this is like, official canon in the machine vision industry, or if we're just like, making stuff up like this is what it's called, inventing the English language, deciding rules for it. But if you want to talk about like what you have to factor in when you're using one over the other, because both of them can be, a good solution if depending on your application. But in other applications, I think you would say like definitely choose one over the other.
Yeah. So for both of them, I will say that if you have either an RGB light or full color light and you're only using one channel or one wavelength at a time, your light is a third of the intensity that it would be compared to like the monochromatic version of that light. And so if you're planning on, putting a full color light so you can, when we turn on red light for the red sample, blue light for the blue sample, etc., make sure that you have enough light to keep up with your exposure time, because you're going to be at a third of the intensity of the LED every time you just have one channel on. So that being said, that's equal across both of them. When you have a full color LED, every LED is going to be on. So you'll have a lot more uniformity and more, if you have more LEDs, you would have more intensity. And so you can have good uniformity at shorter light working distances, but it's a higher cost because the LED, full color LED is going to cost more than monochromatic LED, which is, I think, why CCS does that, because we pride ourselves in like the uniformity, but you pay a little more versus FLX is like, we are, a very, very good high quality, but like more affordable option. And so they do the RGB. And so that one, you have every third LED on. And so if you get really close to the sample, you don't have the uniformity that you need. So you have to move it further away to make sure that you have the uniformity across your whole field of view. And so a lot of times, being further away, you don't have as much intensity as well. So that's something to consider, but the FULX ones you can overdrive pretty easily, so you can kind of compensate for it in that regard. But that's kind of the biggest ones is you will have more uniformity with the full color for shorter light working distances, but more cost effective with an RGB, but you have to be further away to maintain the uniformity of the light.
Yeah. And then kind of going back to our talk on, color accuracy measurements, do the full color and RGB lights have a benefit for those? I think of the, computational imaging kind of applications where we, use red, green, and blue light and kind of put together the composite image, especially when you're using a monochrome camera versus, and how well is that performing compared to like, white light with a color camera?
Yeah, that's a good, gosh, I haven't thought about that computational imaging.
You
and so
wanted
on.
to forget
I
about
tried to
it.
repress it and you keep bringing it back. Well, so it's interesting when you do a full color RGB on, it's going to look white. So if you have all three wavelengths on at the same time, it will look very similar to a white LED. But the actual spectral distribution of it, so the white one's going to have a continuous one, the bump at blue, the dip, and then the little, bump there. The red, green, and blue is going to have 3 different bumps at 3 different wavelengths. So you don't have the same spectral response at the kind of like intermediate wavelengths. You have some, you know what I mean? But it's much more of a peaks, three separate peaks instead of a continuous line. So when we utilized that with the, gosh, what was that? Getting a full color image with a monochrome camera, the benefits of that are a monochrome camera, because you don't have to put that Bayer filter on top of the sensor or whatever filter it is, but you can have kind of a higher resolution with a monochrome camera than with a color. So if we use the RGB value and then essentially the algorithm of the camera goes pixel by pixel and picks the perfect pixel for the, best response, you can get a color image with a monochrome camera. And so it essentially can, take when, like you say, there's like a pink square and a blue square, and you turn on a red light, this is going to have, like red 255, blue 7, green 4, and then blue 255, whatever. And so it can kind of take each one of those pixels and then put it in the color camera and tell you there's this much red, this much blue, this much green in every single pixel. And so in terms of having that be full color versus RGB, you would want RGB in that regard, because we want to know how much each pixel is getting at each one of those wavelengths, versus if you just did blue, it would you would have more of a response at blue because there's more intensity at blue than at red and green. So we would use an RGB camera to do the full color monochrome image. But if you want to just go with a white light, it's better to pick a white LED instead of turning on all 3. You can turn on all, it's not, most of them, it's not going to really be that different. Like I kind of said, unless you're doing high color inspections, it's, kind of one and the same, but you'll get more intensity usually with one white LED versus an RGB LED on at the same, or a full color LED with all channels on.
And you don't want to, I don't know, strobe overdrive your full color light to get the intensity you need, or does that work?
You
also
could, yeah, that's just an LED. You could overdrive it if you had to. So if that's, to get the intensity requires overdriving, there's no, as long as you do it within the rating of the light, which the rating of the LED might not be as high as like a monochromatic LED. So, but you can do it, just maybe not as much. Just do it within its boundaries, I suppose is not the right word, but a word.
I guess go listen to our last episode about strobing and overdrive.
Oh, yeah.
Where we tackle that more. Yeah, so we talked about white light and monochromatic lights and kind of the specialized versions of that kind of combine both of those into one. I guess we'll end on non-standard visible wavelengths, because we can do it, or every lighting manufacturer too, so they can do it. I'm curious because I don't know if I've ever seen, a project where that that was actually a requirement. So if you wanted to share a story from your engineering days, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, every once in a while somebody comes and like a lot of it is the ink that they're using is invisible, but like is visible at like 365 or like 395 nanometers. And that's just like a rating of the ink. And so sometimes it's just the property of the material that these people are using. They know that, it has a better reflectance at this specific wavelength. And so then they come to us and be like, can we have, a 535 red, and we can get it. We can make the light that way. It's super easy to do. And that's not something that a typical, I'm solving this application, like OEM is doing, where they like would have to think about that. Kind of the people who are working like really specialized things would like consider that and factor that in. More often, I would say though, people want like a specific spectrum. And so like in order to like reach that spectrum, we have to like get LEDs to like, because if you get, like RGB, you get like the bump, right? But if you need a flat spectrum or like to go further, then you have to add an LED to like flatten it. So sometimes we're adding LEDs to this full light, so the spectrum looks more like this instead of the bumps. And then you have to decide how you're organizing the LEDs on the light to make sure it's still uniform. And so that's where you kind of get into what is the uniqueness. There's a better word for it that I can't think of right now. The skill maybe of building a custom light with like a specific wavelength to get a specific distribution. And then you have to like adjust the intensity of each light. Because if you have one light's more intense than the other, then you'll have like a huge spike and the rest will be down here. So you have to like lower the intensity of that specific wavelength, that kind of thing. So that's more where we find the off wavelengths that aren't your standard RGB is doing that.
Yeah, I guess that's like the reasoning behind Japan's, they're always asking like 50 questions. I guess, and it makes sense though, because if you want to design the light with the right intensity and uniformity, and I don't know, depending on how demanding your application is, it's like not always as straightforward as like, yes, we can make a blue-green light or an orange light or whatever.
Yeah, it's so funny. When I was doing app engineering, it was like, I just want Japan to tell me if they can do this. Like, I just need to know if it's possible right now. Just being like, can you just, and then inevitably, even if you say, I just need to know if it's feasible, they come back and be like, well, what's the uniformity they required? And like, what is this? Does it have to be so intense? And in the beginning, I was so frustrated. I was like, just tell me. And then now I'm like, okay, it might be feasible unless they need it like this, then it's not feasible. So really, in order for them to give like a proper answer, they do need that information. So I started getting better at getting that information ahead of time and being like, uniformity won't matter, this will, and then they could give me a better answer. But it was so funny that you just think a simple like, is this possible? No, we need way more
Yeah.
information before we can tell you yes or no.
Yeah, I guess like the answer for non-machine vision lighting people is like, we can make just about any wavelength these days in LEDs, but depending on what you're going to do with it, like what you need it to do, we can probably make it, but it could be the difference between like just switching up something in an existing light that we already make or like having to redesign like the whole inside of like heat management or that PCB board or whatever, which inevitably gets more complicated.
Yeah, it does. And it's convenient that we have the ability to do the whole spectrum, like just swapping out here you go, we'll put different LED in this, you're good to go. Or like, oh, we need a full redesign to like accommodate the uniformity requirement and the intensity and the wavelength that you need. We can cover the board. And so it's been able to help out a lot of customers. I think Emily froze a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's for attractive things. But yeah, here we are. I
Yeah.
don't know. This is like, at least I didn't turn purple, I guess, is the,
Oh, now you're gone.
is the upside. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just one of these days. We are embracing the, imperfections of early day podcast is how we're talking about this, how we're framing it in our heads. So with that, since I'm probably going to be stuck like this for the rest of the episode, maybe we'll just, start to close out because I think we've covered just about everything anyway. So hopefully people learned something. But yeah, stuff we need to plug. Our anniversary campaign is still going on. So if you spend a certain amount of money on a lab order, you will get a free either a controller or light for your lab. So more lights for you to test with. Can talk to our sales team for more about that. Is there anything else? By the time this comes out, SemiCon will be over already, so can't say come to our booth.
The technical roundtable in Ohio is in November. So if you are in that area or feel like getting on a plane, there's still some spots available. And that's where we do, it's about a big part of it is the lighting principles where we get into, how we use the physics of light to solve applications and create that contrast that we need in a way that like makes sense of like what you actually need to know. Not like I'm not, it's not a physics lesson by any means. I couldn't teach that if I wanted to. But in terms of how it relates to machine vision, and then there's a little bit of, the pitfalls of machine vision and how we kind of solve applications. And then the hands-on portion is really the most valuable part where you can take all the pieces that you just learned and like try them out in front of me and Aredo, or me and Jason, I suppose, to kind of talk about like, yeah, you solved this because of this reason. So we give applications each person has to solve or each group has to solve that will kind of show the principles we just talked about so you can kind of get more understanding because half the time you do a presentation and so this way all the feedback we've gotten is like, oh yeah, this is where it really solidified for me. So that's coming up in November in Dayton, Ohio.
Yeah. So if, it's difficult for you to get to Boston or Michigan, which is like, our hubs, but I think like one of the best things about doing the technical roundtables is that we're kind of going around the country to places that don't necessarily, get in-person trainings very often, especially not in Ohio. This is like the first time I will ever be in Ohio in my life. So if you're in that area, it's like a great opportunity. You don't have to wait for the next, I don't know, industry training event or whatever, fly out to Boston or fly to Detroit. It'll be right in your backyard. So hope to see some listeners there. But yeah, if you learned something new about machine vision lighting today, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. And you can follow CCS America, Lindsey, and myself on LinkedIn. Follow Lindsey, not me, because she talks about engineering stuff, machine vision lighting engineering stuff. That's probably what the people on this or watching this want. But yeah, feel free to send questions or topic ideas. We'd love to hear it. And with that, thanks for listening.
Thanks, guys.